Reimagining Chapel. My name is Amanda Esco, and I am the director of the Religious Education Program here at the First Unitarian Church of Salt Lake City. I am so glad you're joining me today. Let's begin our worship service like we always begin our worship services here and across our nation and world by lighting our chalice. If you have a chalice at home, maybe a flower pot chalice like I have here, I invite you to go get it right now and light it with me. Symbol of light, symbol of knowledge, symbol of warmth, symbol of freedom. We light this chalice as a symbol of our faith. Here we gather to celebrate hope and the infinite possibilities of love. It is a brand new year. I am so glad we are here together. The start of 2021 has continued to be as difficult as 2020, unfortunately. We did have the violence at our nation's capital, as well as the ongoing pandemic. It's been hard here, and I want to acknowledge that for us all. We thought, well, not really, but we hoped that 2021 would be better. I still have that hope, but it looks like it might take a little bit longer for us to get to those easier feelings. That's why I'm glad we have community together. We can join together on our Zoom worship when we're able, or in our classes, or right here on YouTube or Facebook, and be together in community. Sometimes just hearing a friendly voice makes me feel better. How about you? Let's now do something that we usually do when we're together. Share our joys and concerns. I want you to share your joys and concerns with the people around you that love you the most. Tell them what's going well, what maybe you need help with. I'll be right here waiting for you. Thanks for sharing your joys and concerns with the people around you who love you. I'm glad that even though things are hard, we still have people in our lives that offer us support. I know I was able to talk to friends this week on the phone, and it made me feel better. I hope that talking with the people that love you helped you feel better too. Now we get to learn about our UU of the week from Miss Lissa. Thank you, Lissa.
Hi, I'm Lissa Lander, and I'm the Religious Education Assistant at the First Unitarian Church of Salt Lake City. Today on UU of the Week, we are going to learn about UU minister and social justice advocate Homer Jack. The Reverend Homer Jack was a Unitarian Universalist minister from Rochester, New York. He was born in the year 1919 and died in 1993. Homer Jack was an outspoken and effective activist and organizer for racial equality and social justice. Social justice and religion were a bit of a family business for Homer Jack. Both of his parents knew and worked with Susan B. Anthony, and Homer later married Esther, who was the daughter of the local Unitarian minister. As a result, Jack heard the call to become a Unitarian minister himself and began working on his degree in 1940, graduating from Meadville in 1944. During this time, Homer and Esther had 2 children. Homer Jack served as a minister in a few places after that, but it never quite fit. When he began working for Chicago Council Against Racial and Religious Discrimination, he finally found his calling to build a coalition of organizations that would work together on racial and religious matters. At this time in America, white and black people were deeply divided, not just socially, but by Jim Crow laws, which claimed to keep the races separate but equal, although this was rarely the case, if ever. Homer Jack made it his life's work to make sure that Americans were equal regardless of their skin color. He worked for equality in land ownership, education, and transportation. In 1946, Homer Jack helped organize a journey for reconciliation. 16 people, half of them black and half of them white, rode buses, sitting anywhere they wanted. And this sounds silly today, but back then this was against the law. Black people could only sit at the back of the bus. Each time the bus crossed state lines on the journey for reconciliation, the 16 riders got arrested over and over again. This demonstration was widely covered in the press, and later it became the model for the Freedom Riders, who eventually helped desegregate the buses in America. In 1956, Homer Jack met the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. at the Montgomery bus boycott. They became dear friends. Dr. King even asked Homer Jack to preach to his congregation at the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. Dr. King said of his friend in 1959, "Homer Jack is certainly one of the most dedicated persons that I have ever met. He combines the fact-finding mind of a social scientist with the great insights of a religious prophet." That's quite a compliment in my book. Homer Jack continued his work for racial justice, traveling all over the world and creating change. He was occasionally caught up in the already tense race relations within the UUA, but overall, he ended his career with many prestigious awards and honors. The Reverend Dr. Homer Alexander Jack died of pancreatic cancer in 1993. But we are so happy to add his biography to our growing UU of the Week collection. To learn more about other fascinating Unitarian Universalists, go to uuoftheweek.org. Thank you for joining me, and we'll see you next time.
This month, we have been exploring the idea of imagination. Let's see if what's in our Wonder Box today will help us with what we're going to imagine. Oh, the Wonder Box is bursting open. I can't even get it shut. Look, it's a globe. Today for our Wonder Box, I wanted us to imagine what it would be like to have a more just world. What would that be like? What would need to change? I know for myself, when I imagine a more just and equitable world, I think about things like food, housing, education, and how we treat one another. A lot of these issues are issues that are part of larger systems in our society. Something we've talked about a lot this year at First Church has been directly related to these systems, systemic racism. In the past, we've talked about systemic racism, but today I wanted to share with you a new book that came out just this year that I think does a really nice job of describing systemic racism. It was written by Jordan Theory. Here's the book, and here's his picture. Jordan is a Black American father who has written this book to help explain this very big topic to everyone. I'm going to read it to you today. And as I read, I want you to think about what we would need to imagine to change in our world to make it more just and equitable for everyone.
A Kid's Book About Systemic Racism by Jordan Theory. This is a book about systemic racism, and believe it or not, it's actually for kids. I have to say, this book was really hard to write. Systemic racism is incredibly difficult to understand, even for grown-ups. But to help make sense of it, I'm going to start with an example. I'm Black. Did you know that it's really rare for someone with my skin color to write a kid's book? When I was a kid, I almost never read a book by a Black author. That might seem normal or like no big deal, but it shouldn't be normal, and it is a big deal. But that's how it works. Systemic racism seems normal. It's almost like it's invisible. Something that's always around, but you never quite see it, unless you look really hard. So my hope with this kids' book is to help you not only see it, but want to do something about it. You might already know what racism is. It's when someone is excluded, treated badly, or hated because of their race or skin color. Systemic racism is when racist ideas are built into laws, schools, stories, and other institutions in a way that collectively makes life much harder for people of color. Let me give you some more examples. When I was a kid, the only people on TV that looked like me were athletes, comedians, or rappers. When I was in school, I was suspended for things that my white friends often were not. When I was in class, I never had a teacher that looked like me until I went to college. When I was a teenager, I was stopped by the police multiple times, while many of my white friends weren't. Looking at these moments, it may not seem like it was about the color of my skin, but systemic racism isn't always obvious, which is what makes it so hard to see. Before I understood that, I used to get frustrated and angry, even at myself. But as I grew up, I noticed I wasn't the only one experiencing this. Other people of color were experiencing the same things. But that's when I started to notice a pattern. I learned that if you're black, you're more likely to be stopped by the police. It can be harder to get a job. It can be more difficult to buy a home. You're less likely to go to a good school. You're less likely to be in charge. And most heroes and stories don't look like you. As you read these things, you might feel sad or even angry. You might also start to wonder how it got this way. Well, the reason is long and complicated, but I'll do my best to explain. Since the start of our country, many people with white skin whose families came from Europe were given land, opportunity, and access to money, while people of color, those with black or brown skin, and the indigenous people that lived on the land before white people arrived, were attacked, killed, and sold into slavery. Lies were told about people of color to scare white people, to make white people believe that people of color would hurt them, steal their property, or give them diseases. Yes, really. Sadly, many people believed those lies. Then, even after they fought for their freedom, people of color still didn't have as many rights. They still had more obstacles and experienced a lot of discrimination. New laws were even created to make life harder for them because many white people didn't want to share. Over time, the value of land and money increased, which gave white people more and more for their kids, grandkids, and so on. Today, this unequal balance of who has land, money, power, and rights still exists and affects people of color. It affects their ability to live in nice homes and neighborhoods. It affects their ability to start their own businesses and donate their money to good causes. It affects the amount of money that is put into building schools and hiring great teachers. It affects their ability to speak their own languages and preserve their cultures. It affects their ability to tell their own stories or make their own TV shows and movies. It affects who has access to medicine and good doctors. It affects how they are treated by the police, government, and court system. All of these things are the result of systemic racism. And even though people of color have more equality today than they ever have, new forms of systemic racism are created all the time. We need to change the system and erase the racist ideas that live in our laws, schools, stories, and other institutions. We need to create ways for people of color who have been left behind for so long to catch up so that money, land, great schools, quality doctors, and basic rights are equally available to everyone. Systemic racism isn't new. It's just hard to see. But once you do, it's hard to ignore. So practice seeing systemic racism every day. In the schools you go to, movies you watch, neighborhood you live in. Point it out to your friends. Point it out to your family. Because systemic racism can't be undone until we open our eyes and see it.
I know that this kind of book can be overwhelming. That's because systemic racism is overwhelming. As Mr. Theory said in the book, systemic racism seems invisible, even though it's not. Once you start seeing it in one place, you start to see it everywhere. Well, what can we do? What can we imagine to help fight systemic racism in our hearts, like the 8th principle asks us to do, and in our communities? One of the best things that you can do is something you're already really good at. Ask lots of questions. When you don't see people of color represented, ask why. If you only have books written by white authors, ask why. I have to warn you though, sometimes these questions have answers, and sometimes the answers are very hard to find. That's okay. As Unitarian Universalists, our 4th principle asks us to go looking for answers to life's big questions. It might take time, but with perseverance, imagination, and a desire for justice, I know we can imagine and work towards a more just, equitable world free of systemic racism. Thank you for joining us today for Reimagining Chapel. Until next time, let's heart out.
Each person is important. To be kind in all